Hello and welcome to the Chatterbox Letters podcast. Today I will be doing a special presentation. I will be reading my self-published book, my sequel to the Minorities, the pilot. I will be reading to everyone the Minorities, Richard's Indiscretion, Chapter 1. I hope that everyone will enjoy my sequel while I read to everyone the Minorities, Richard's Indiscretions. This will be my huge chatter letter to my viewers. Let me go ahead and get my sequel to the Minorities, the pilot. Okay, here it goes. Chapter 1, A Time of Healing. It was the early morning at the Langston household. 2 years passed since Sarah Langston's brutal attack. She tried to put her life back together the best way she knew how, with the support of her father, Paul Langston. Every now and then, Sarah would get emotional with a full dose of torment that reminded her of her brutal attack from her ex-boyfriend, Richard Morris. Every single night, Sarah awake from the horror of her recurring flashback of the attack that Richard inflicted on her, face heavily covered and drenched in tears. Sarah got out of her bed and walked through the connecting doors to her room to look in on her baby, Paul Robert. He slept soundly in his crib, unaware of his mother's horror and torment from her brutal attack from his father, Richard. Sarah walked up to Paul Robert's crib and carefully lifted him up out of the crib into her arms. Paul Robert, awake as his mother swallowed him with his favorite blanket, she began to nurse him with her motherly love, while in thought for the justice she received from her brutal attack that Richard inflicted on her. Sarah continued to be in fear that Richard would someday be released from the state penitentiary in revenge that he would eventually kill her for sending him to prison for life. Okay. She was emotionally terrified for her life as softly whispered to Paul Robert, revealing the truth about his father. Okay, next page. I'm so glad that your daddy isn't here. It's been 2 years since your daddy went to prison, and I'm proud of it, Paul Robert. We don't need him. Sarah walked over to her rocking chair and sat down with Paul Robert in her arms. While she cradled and nursed him, she looked into his eyes as she continued whispering softly to her son about his father. Sarah revealed every single truth about Richard to Paul Robert. The terror still lingered in her eyes for Richard. Sarah was still afraid of Paul Robert's father. I don't know what I'm going to do, Paul Robert, if and when your father gets out of prison. I'm still so afraid that when he get out, he's going to come and get me or maybe kill me. I'm still so afraid of your father, Paul Robert. I truly believe, son, he will come out of prison and kill me. I hate to say this to you, but I never want you to know your daddy, ever. I really don't want him to hurt me or ever, but I don't know how to go by preventing it from happening. Sarah held Paul Robert up onto her shoulder as she began to cry. Her father, Paul Langston, was awakened by his daughter's cries. He got out of his bed, walked abruptly through the hallways towards Sarah's room to check on her and his grandson. Paul noticed Sarah standing on the side of Paul Robert's crib. He informed Sarah of what he overheard while he slumbered in his room. The conversation between her and his grandson. Paul was worried about Sarah and the torment she suffered from her brutal attack from Richard. He often worried about and observed his daughter's well-being as he observed Sarah looking around Paul Robert's nursery from one side to the other, looking at all four corners of each wall. Sarah looked around and saw her father standing in the doorway of the nursery staring at her. Now Sarah continued to torment from the flashbacks of an attack as her father stood in the doorway. Worried about his daughter, Paul walked up to Sarah and Paul Robert and took them into his arms. He felt that Sarah will have an emotional breakdown, and that gets the best of her if he does not help her the best way he knew how. Sarah removed herself from her father's embrace, walked up towards the window of the nursery. She cried. She looked out the window in terror as she saw Richard in her imagination. Paul questions his daughter about the experience and dealing with the fact that Richard will someday get out of prison. Are you still having those flashbacks, Sarah? Paul questioned Sarah. She replied to her father while looking out the window in complete emotional daze. Yes, Daddy, it's a total nightmare. I don't think I'm going to ever get over the punches and the bruises I was inflicted with, and Richard hurting me continuously over and over again, destroying my heart, my body, my soul. These horrible flashbacks will never leave me. I just know it. They seem to occur more often than ever, Daddy. I'm consistently being haunted by the fear of Richard, of what he might do once he's released from prison. If he gets out of prison with a life sentence, I'm even scared of my own shadows, Daddy. I feel that Richard is going to be released from prison. He's coming to kill me. I know he will. Sarah paced back and forth in the nursery, making complete circles. Sarah continued to rehash the facts from her reoccurring flashbacks. Every night, every day, during the day, I think of what Richard and what he did to me, Daddy. Excuse me. He destroyed my life mentally, physically, and totally emotionally. I think I'm going completely nuts, and I don't know how I'm going to overcome this horror and torment that was that has taken over my soul. It's draining all the life out of me, Daddy. It still hurts my heart inside and out. What I'm going to do to overcome this madness. Paul was blunt when he answered Sarah. I don't know, sweetie. All I could tell you is Richard will never hurt you again. I promise you, Sarah. I will kill him if it is the last thing I will do. I'll go to prison for you and my grandson. And that's without hesitation. At that moment, it was Paul's intentions to give up his life for Sarah and Paul, Robert. Sarah was consumed with gratitude and appreciation for her father for vowing to give up his life for her and his grandson. All right, next page. Let's get it to the next page. All right. Oh, Daddy, I do not want you to go to jail for me, even if it's out of love for me and Paul Robert. I do not want you locked up alongside Richard. You know you are better than that. He will never be a daddy. Plus, you are smarter than that. I don't want to lose you, Daddy. Paul acknowledged his daughter's status as a devoted parent and his love for her and his grandson. He was determined to make Sarah understand if she were in the same situation and position when it came down to showing unconditional love for Paul Robert and for what she would do if she were in his shoes. You're a wonderful parent, Sarah, and I love you dearly. Just think about it for a second. If anyone hurt Paul Robert, what would you do, Sarah? Paul Robert is the most important part of your life, and you'll do anything to protect him. Believe me, Sarah, you'll think twice when it comes to showing unconditional love for your son. You think just like me. You will, sweetheart. I hate what that monster did, and I hate what that monster Richard did to you, Sarah. Sarah put Paul Robert down in his crib and she swallowed him. She was very still emotional about Richard put her through. For the past 2 years, she lived in terror of him. She felt as though she will never again live in peace for as long as Richard is alive. With her father still in presence in the doorway, Sarah immediately turned to her father and embraced him tightly, searching for an ounce of security within his heart. I know, Daddy, I really appreciate you for all you do for me and all the love you give me and Paul Robert. But I need to start learning to deal with this tragedy the Richard has inflicted on me, and I can only do this the best way I know how. I know I got to do this on my own. Thanks for your support, Daddy. I may or may not heal entirely. I will eventually heal from this tragedy and from Richard's evil ways. The best thing I got out of this whole terrifying ordeal is my son, Paul Robert. Paul looked into Sarah's eyes. He was still worried about her and Paul Robert's safety. Sarah again embraced her father. I'm going to be fine, Daddy. You will see. I will eventually get over this nightmarish tragedy. You'll see, Daddy. Sarah and her father stood over Paul Robert's crib without uttering another word about her brutal attack and Richard's indiscretions. Paul Robert slumbered silently in his crib. Paul and Sarah prayed over Paul Robert and for themselves. They lifted their hands towards heaven and asked God for a shield of protection to surround them in safety against anything evil that may enter their home and in their presence, including Richard. Later that afternoon at the state penitentiary, Richard Morris was waiting impatiently for his longtime friend and his accomplice, Franklin Nash. He requested to be secluded from the rest of the other inmates so that he would be able to talk to Franklin in private. Richard looked around at the other inmates and their families while waiting for Franklin to show up. Richard had already set his plan in motion to assassinate his ex-friends Kevin Osborne and Luther Rollins for their disloyalty towards him during the time of his ex-girlfriend's brutal attack. Franklin arrived at the penitentiary visiting waiting area. There he saw Richard secluded from the other inmates waiting for him on the other side of the plexiglass. He had looks that can kill a bull 3 ways than their horns can curve. Franklin sat down calmly in front of Richard. He would slowly pick up the phone and placed it onto his ear. He was reluctant to utter a single word, while he now wanted to immediately question Richard's intentions for his visit and why he wanted to see him so badly. Franklin decided to play cautiously at Richard's evil game. Nervously, Franklin started questioning Richard's intentions for his visit at the penitentiary. Hey, Richard, what do I owe the honor of your presence? What do you want from a brother? Richard immediately replied to Franklin with his demands to assassinate his ex-friends Kevin and Luther. Franklin was surprised about Richard's death threats against his ex-friends Kevin and Luther, or even his girlfriend Sarah Langston. He knew Richard's evil agenda was very serious, straight into the center of the target about his intentions in carrying out the assassination of his ex-friends. When it came down to showing his loyalty for, next page, for him and initiating big jobs under his command when it comes to carrying out a task or running numbers and attacking people without a specific reason why it happened. Ordering assassinations on somebody's life without reluctance was a part of Richard's code of violence. Within his reign of terror, initiated directly under his command without hesitation and no questions asked from anyone on the inside and outside of the penitentiary, or whatever his status may reside. Richard had become an enormously powerful monster by his own conscience. Richard did not want to waste any more time with his plan to assassinate Kevin and Luther. Richard's demands was very abrupt. He really wanted Kevin Osborne and Luther Rollins dead on impact. He demanded that Franklin help him carry out the assassination attempt on Kevin and Luther's life. I want you to get rid of some people for me. I want you to permanently get rid of my so-called ex-friends of mine, some ex-Scuzz Buckets, Beavis and Butthead for helping the police, and ex-girlfriend for sending me away to this hellhole for life. Richard made a commitment that sealed the fate against his parents. He emancipated himself from his parents, a separation that was approved by the court of law. I don't care what my parents think or how they think of me anymore, because I don't care about me anyway. They do not come or even come to visit me with compassion. At least that is what I want you to think. As for my ex-girlfriend, Sarah, I will handle her myself if ever I get out of here on approved probation. That whore has taken everything from me, even my baby. She will never get away with it. So as long as I'm alive and kicking, I need you to help to get me out of here, this hellhole, Franklin. Whenever the pleasure is yours. But for now, I want you to help me get this hit on these two midget punks, Kevin and Luther. Richard continued demanding Franklin's help to get out of jail and to join his reign of terror in carrying out his devious attack against his ex-friends. Hey man, I'm not going out hanging all this heat down on me and doing this killing spree on your ex-friends Kevin and Luther, or anyone else in this matter, bro. I'm not going to find my butt in here with you rotting in Sodom and Gomorrah, kid. Franklin continued opt into questioning Richard Devious' plan to assassinate his ex-friends. You know how that's going to look for me, Richard, in the long run, do you? I don't want to be in here with you locked up for the rest of my life. You still my brother, but dang. Richard looked at Franklin's disloyalty in total disbelief. Richard became extremely aggressive with Franklin as though he was ready to cut Franklin with a sharp razor and dip him in a bucket of alcohol. Richard condemned Franklin for his comment and dishonoring his loyalty to carry out his reign of terror against those who helped him go to prison, and his breaking his code of violence, and for not joining his gang of terror. Richard continued his death threats and violent ultimatums against his ex-friends and on Franklin until he joined his game. So what you're saying, Frank, are you wimping out on me like a little sissy? Or did I stutter on that? I got some hacks outside of this mother humper who will take care of this business for me. Hacks who think just like me. They will take care of business for me. Anytime of any day. So I say to you, my brother, Mr. Franklin Sissy Natch, what are you going to do about carrying out my plan? Franklin replied to Richard, violent ultimatums with complete haste. So what you're saying, Richard, what you are fronting on me, portraying me as a dog on a sissy? Richard pressed his face against the plexiglass, squeezing his nose firmly, aggressively punching the plexiglass with his fist, alerting two correctional guards to his presence. They handcuffed Richard's wrists while he sat in front of Franklin. Richard quickly stood up and lifted his hands over his head to the officer, forcing him to stop in his tracks. Richard assured the officers that his outburst would never happen again. He looked at different officers in a devious look. Next page. All right, make sure I'm on the next page. Correctionals. I'm sorry for knocking and screaming, bucking out of control, just a little out of hand. It won't happen again, I promise you sincerely. Richard calmed down in front of Franklin and continued his conversation with him. So it's like that, my sissy brother. It's like that. You seem to be fronting on me with all this garbage pouring out of your thoughts and out of your mouth. Richard paused briefly, silencing his aggressive with Franklin as another correctional officer staring at as they briefly passed their secluded booth. Richard knew a complete low profile, thought out the rest of his visit and conversation with Franklin. He looked around to see if any more correction officers looking his way, trying to lurk past his secluded privacy of his booth with Franklin, so that they can announce his second violent ultimatum to assassinate ex-friends Kevin and Luther. You just doggone completely nuts on me, Frankie. You done lost your gristle and all of your backbone needed to carry out this hit for me. I fronted you with Frankie, and now you're trying to wimp out on me. Richard insisted that Franklin join his gang of terror. Hey Richard, my man. I told you, kid, and I am not a wimp to be a wimp in this case, or in this matter. Quit fronting on me, kid. Just chill for a second, Franklin said in haste. So you're telling me that you're game with my proposition to carry out this hit for me, and are you still freaking the freak out on me to do this hit, Frankie? Because I told you I got some hacks on the outside of this mother humper who will take care of this hit for me and other business propositions I may lay out to like a bed comforter and me under it with the honey, or maybe in the midst of everything. I think I'll have you taken care of as well if you don't do this hit for me. Richard's death threat towards Franklin became his ultimated reality. Oh, how? Oh, now you're threatening me, you punk behind again. Franklin replied to Richard in anger. Richard rudely smiled at Franklin. He presented Franklin with a financial offer to assassinate his ex-friends. There are 2 hacks who work for me on the outside. I'll have them throw you a C-note ahead for this hit I painfully want you to do, because I am on a personal vendetta to carry out this hit, Franklin, darling. So if you still interested, or if you still a little sissy, or shall I say, you still wimping the wimp out on me. Without hesitation, Richard presented his final ultimatum to Franklin to accept his $1,000 bribe to join his gang of terror. Franklin finally accepted Richard's deadly offer to join his gang of terror. I'm in, Richard, you punk behind fool. Front me once I get out of this mother humper, and 2 C-notes per head instead of 1. Franklin demanded more money from Richard outside his accomplices. No more talk on this delicate matter, Richard. I'm with you, dog, on this devious plan of yours. You said you got your girlfriend, Sarah, right? Richard replied. Heck yeah, I got my beautiful ex-girlfriend, Richard said deviously with a smile. You don't worry about her, mon ami. Franklin gave Richard his thumbs up, acknowledging his will to join Richard's gang of terror. To help him carry out this deadly reign of terror with his plan to assassinate his ex-friends, Kevin and Luther. Richard stared at Franklin like a snake called Medusa, as if he was turning him into the sandiest stone. He was extremely determined to carry out his assassination attempt to his ex-friends Kevin and Luther, killed permanently. Although Richard immediately had second thoughts about Richard's loyalty to him for carrying out his deadly demands and his plan to assassinate his ex-friends, Richard mumbled to Franklin about his continued verbal threats against Sarah's life. Franklin listened in. Richard continued to mumble about Sarah. Okay, next page. Next page. All right. Yes, Sarah, with will be an easy task for me to perform my ultimate revenge against her and for taking my son away from me. I'll take care of her as soon as I get out of this mother humper. She won't see what's coming to her, that's for sure. Franklin immediately got up from the table, separating himself from Richard's evil indiscretions, and exited the visiting waiting area. I'm out of here, you punk, behind Negro. 2 hours after Franklin left the penitentiary, Richard used his only phone call he never made to his parents to contact one of his accomplices. He used the code of violence to set in motion the assassination of his ex-friends, Kevin and Luther. Hey, I got the party favor for y'all. Advance to notes a pop instead of one. Advance them jokers to call this cat Franklin Nash, so all my problems will be solved expeditiously. Silent. Richard hung up the phone and walked quietly out of the visiting area waiting room towards his cell block, while heavily guarded by correction officers, without uttering another sound. Meanwhile, at the Morris's household, the evening was bittersweet. Eddie and Charlotte sat peacefully in their living room, drinking coffee and still emotionally traumatized by Richard's indiscretions. They continued to wonder where they went wrong with their son. Charlotte sipped the coffee while Eddie looked on. Charlotte reflected on the years past since she and Eddie saw Richard last. You know, Eddie, it's been a couple of years since we last seen our son. Sometimes I think to myself, where did we go wrong with Richard? Was there anything that we could have done differently to help our son, Eddie? Eddie replied to Charlotte without hesitation. Charlotte, there isn't anything we can do. There was anything we could have did differently to help our son. We tried with all our might to set him straight and on the right path. We did everything we knew possible to help Richard, and there is nothing else we could do for him as his parents. Richard chose his path of life, and that will be his fate to deal with. We did not go wrong anywhere, with Richard. Charlotte, trust me, love. We gave him a good life. We gave him our lives. Instead, he decided to give his life to Satan and those green garbage cans he called friends that hang out with him before he went into the state penitentiary and to the streets. But you know, I've been hearing Richard's name a lot on the streets lately, Charlotte. Shocked and surprised, Charlotte got up from the sofa and turned to Eddie as they faced to face. Where is this talk going? Where is it coming from about Richard on the streets, Eddie? Charlotte replied to Eddie. From some of his old tacky, low-down hustler friends, local drug dealers, pimps, hoodlums, and all sorts of other green garbage cans. Some some scam buckets out on the streets. Excuse me, I'm twisting my tongue right now. Shocked but disbelief, Charlotte decided to ultimately give up on her son Richard because of his indiscretions, not only as a mother, but as a person who decided that she has enough of her son's evil ways of doing devious deeds as he continued, even inside the prison walls, as he continued to give his life to the street. For Charlotte, it was Richard's fate to pursue his life of crime within the state penitentiary and out on the streets. Charlotte ultimately proceeded to vow that Richard do not exist to her anymore, like she never gave birth to him. Richard had become a bad seed in his mother's eyes and his father. I don't know anymore, Eddie. Like I've been thinking about our son a whole lot lately. He is like a totally different person, and he's become invisible to me like a ghost. Sometimes I wonder what kind of person I gave birth to. Eddie looked at Charlotte. He stood up from the sofa and walked over to the window. He stood stiff as a board as he looking in a daze out of the window. Eddie tried to piece together with his thoughts and where he went wrong with Richard. Charlotte walked over to Eddie and embraced him from behind. With her unfinished cup of coffee in her hand, she ended her conversation with Eddie about Richard with a little peace of mind and their thoughts to begin to wander through the window panes and out on the other side. Though the air on the outside breezing their sorrows away with dignity. Let's go to the next page. Charlotte and Eddie kissed. Charlotte decided it was time to go upstairs to bed. Eddie, are you coming up to bed? Charlotte replied to as he stood at the top of the stairway, looking down at Eddie. I'll be there in a bit, honey bunches. At the top of the stairwell, Charlotte finished her last bit of coffee before she met with Eddie halfway down the stairs to give him the empty cup to Eddie to put in the kitchen sink. Eddie went back into the living room and continued to stare out the window. He was still deep in thought of where he went wrong with Richard. Eddie was determined to find a solution to his worries and to his misconception and Richard's indiscretions. Okay, I just read to you Chapter 1, A Time of Healing. I hope you enjoyed this session. I hope everything, you heard me read will capture your heart. All right, I want everyone to like, share, subscribe to my podcast. Hit that notification button to know when I go live. Ring that bell for updates on my podcast. And all right, if anyone have a chatter letter they wants to send to me, please send it to the Chatterbox Letters Podcast, P.O. Box 5556, Lakeland, Florida, 33801. 07. You can write your chatter letter about anything you want to write about. It doesn't matter. And so as long as it's clean, your letter written in clearly written letter and discreet. Please send me, or please do not hesitate to send me your letter, your chatter letter. Procrastinate and send your letter today.